I'm just going to open a blank sheet. Blank file here. We'll start with this, and then we'll open up some other sheets, and we'll do some adjustments to it. Okay, so first off, I want to just do a real simple macro, just to kind of familiarize yourself with macros, so you know what a macro is. Let's start with an open file macro. So you go to View, and on the right side, there's a button here called Macros. And then under the macros, you can actually record a macro. So there's your record button. Now, when you hit the record, it's going to come back with a little interface. The name of the macro must start with a letter, and you can't have spaces in the name. So I'm going to call this my open file macro. Now, all I'm going to do is open a file up. Now, the question I have, and I want to make sure that this name is not a reserved name. So the word sum is probably reserved. There are other commands that are probably reserved names. So oftentimes I'll put a number on the back end of it just so that I know that with a 1 on it is not a reserved name. So if I type the word sum 1, then that's not going to be a reserved name. And that doesn't matter. It'll come back with an error message. Then you just have to put a new name in. But I always put a 1 on the end for several reasons. One reason is the reserved name situation. But also, a lot of times I'll write a macro several times. I'll write a macro, and then I'll forget a couple things. And then I'll go back and write it again. And I might write it 2, sometimes 3 times. And every time I do it a little bit better job. In that case, I would just put a 1 and a 2 and a 3 and a 4. And that way I won't have to go back and clean it up right away. I can just record. And since it's fresh on my mind, I can go back later and clean it up. You can also use a keyboard command. Now, if I type the letter B in here, then that means it's going to override the Control B, which is bold. It's not going to wipe out the Control B, but it will override it so that the Control B won't work. When you delete the macro, then the Control B will come back. A lot of times what I'll do is I'll hold the Shift key down. Like in this case, for instance, open file macro, I'm going to put a Shift O. And that way, a Control Shift O is different than a Control. So in other words, all my macros I would program using the Control Shift keyboard command. And that way I can assign a letter that would be most likely to remember the command that we're going to be using. And I don't really use any other Control Shift keyboard commands unless you do. There are some out there, but I usually don't use them. I usually have Control or Shift keys or Alt keys, but no Control Shift commands. And so that's why I just use the Control Shift on all macros. It's a standard I use. Then you have to decide where you want to store the macro. If you put it in the personal macro workbook, that's going to be in the local library. So in other words, it's on your local system. So in other words, if you want to use that macro for opening another file, you don't have to worry about what files open if each one will do its own thing. Now, the other aspect is put it in this workbook. So if you have some macros need to be in the workbook, because if you email that workbook to somebody, you want the macro to go with it. And we'll show you some examples of each of these. We'll put this in the personal macro workbook for right now because we don't know what file we're going to have open when we open this file up. I also encourage a description of some sort because I have written macros that I thought were the best macros I've ever written in my life. A month later, I had absolutely no idea what they were. So, you don't want to have to go back and run macros because you don't know what they're supposed to do. A lot of times you can put a description in the name when you create the name. If you have to run a macro to figure out what it's doing, then I call that a waste of time because you're trying to save time. Now you're wasting time by going back and looking at all the junk. Okay, so that's my strategy right there. Now, if I say okay to that, now I'm recording right now. Oh, that's right. I got to be a little quiet because it's recording. Now, what is it recording? It's not recording my voice, is it? It's recording commands. It's only recording clicks. So when I click, it recorded that. If I go to File, Open, Browse, and I can open up any file you want, just any file you have in front of you, you can open up all through this 3D format. Here's my file. That's all I wanted to do is just open up that file. And now I have to remember to stop my macro. So I'll go to View, Macro, Stop Recording. You always have to remember to stop recording your macro. I'm going to close off this file. File close. I'm going to run my macro. I have a keyboard command, Control-Shift-O, and that opens up the file. So again, it's just a ways to do things quicker. If you have files that you open on a regular basis, you can give yourself the keyboard command, and it just does it much faster. Again, we have to start doing things quicker and working with Excel. We have to do things more to streamline. In order to do more stuff in Excel, we have to kind of automate as much stuff as we possibly can. And that's the idea of a macro. Now, take it back down to the book and show you a couple of things that I wanted to touch on first. And so we want to talk about our security levels. We want to talk about the basics of a macro using the view. This is the view command. And then we're going to talk about the developers tab. Then we talk about creation of a macro. We talked about this little interface to create a macro. And then we'll get into some other macros. So let's go through and look at our interface first. So go to File, Options, click on Customize Ribbon. Now in the ribbons, there's another ribbon over here called the Developer ribbon. So you click on that Developer tab, and that will actually add a new ribbon to the system that provides some macro-related information. So that gives me a new Developer tab, and there are some macro stuff right over here. There's an option in this ribbon in the Developer called the Macro Security. Click on the Macro Security. This tells you the security levels, how the macros will run. So this shows disable all macros with notification. That is most likely what you want to use. If you use this enable all macros, see the macro is actually a Visual Basic program. And the macro could contain a virus of some sort. So somebody could email you an Excel sheet. You open up the Excel sheet, it could kick off a program that could corrupt your system. You want to make sure that you disable that in case there is a situation like that. It will come back and notify you and say, hey, I'm getting ready to run macros. A macro is going to run. Do you want to do this, yes or no? And you have a choice to say no and disable this type of thing. So you want to make sure that it's disabled because it could be dangerous. So that's the security levels. And then over here we have our recorder macro. Here is our relative and absolute macros we're going to talk about next. And here's your Visual Basic and here's your macros button. So let's go through and write a few macros. This is going to be a relative macro versus an absolute macro. So the difference between a relative and absolute is very, very important in order to get macros to work the way you want them to work. If you don't understand this, this could drive you absolutely crazy. So we're going to start with an absolute macro, and we're going to simply type in our address. So I'm going to practice what I'm going to do before I do it. So I'm going to record my macro, and then once I start my macro up, I'm going to click at A1 first. So I'm going to always start in B first, and my first click is going to be there, which means it's going to start. That's going to be recorded in the macro. Then I'm going to type in my name, my address, and my city, state, and zip, and that's all I'm going to do. And then I'm going to stop the macro. Okay, we're going to click in B. Make sure you're in the absolute macro. So if I click that little checkbox, this little use relative, then the relative is set. If I turn it off, now it's in absolute mode. That's kind of crazy because it's hard to understand that, but that's how that works. It's always been that way. I wish they would change that, but they don't. So make sure it's in absolute mode when you record. Make sure you're in B to start. We're going to call this address ABS, for absolute. If we want to use our 1 in this system, if we have to re-record it for some reason, then we'll give it a 2 and a 3. You give a keyboard if you want. In this case, we're going to call this Shift-A for absolute macro. And we can put this in the personal macro workbook because we might use it in different places. And of course, some sort of description that describes what this macro is designed to do, or what project it was for. So we say OK to that. Our first click is going to be an A. Click. And we're going to type in Jeff Hutchinson. Enter. We're going to type in 1, 2, 3, 4 Test Street. We're going to type in Test USA. And hit the Enter key when I'm done because I haven't actually registered this cell 3. So you want to make sure you hit another Enter when you're done to make sure that gets saved off into the macro. And that's all I want to do. So we're going to stop recording. Now we're going to click in the middle over here, anywhere in the middle, but we're going to write another macro in a relative mode. So we're going to make sure that little thing is highlighted. Click in any cell on the screen and say record a macro. So we're going to call this address REL. I'm going to give it a keyboard command of Shift-R for relative. Put it in the personal macro workbook. I'm going to put a description in here. Then say OK. And we're going to type in Jeff Hutchinson, Test Street. And I'll say Salt Lake City, Utah. Enter. That's it. You have to remember to stop your macro when you're done. So I'm going to come over here, get rid of all that. Now, if I run my absolute macro, I'll give you one guess where it's going to go. So if I do a Control-Shift-A for my absolute macro, it puts it in the absolute location. So wherever I recorded that macro is where it's going to go. If I come over here and I click here and I do a Control-Shift-R, it's going to put it in the relative location. So you can imagine if you were trying to write a relative macro, but you were in the absolute mode, you'll never get it to work right. And it will be very frustrating because it's always going to go back to that same place. So it's important to understand the difference between these two. Most of the time we do absolute, but there are times when we want to do relative. So let me give you some examples. I have a sheet, and every time I create a worksheet, on the top of the worksheet, I put in my name, my company name, my division, and some logos. And I write a macro to put that title in my worksheet. And then I start building my worksheet underneath of that title. And then when I'm done, at the bottom of the worksheet, I want to put in my name, department, and address and contact information. Okay, so what macro type would I use for the title? And of course, you'd use absolute because it's always at the same place. It's always on the top. So I would use an absolute macro to put the title in. What about the name on the bottom? I would use a relative macro because I don't know where the bottom is. It could be anywhere. I don't know how big the sheet is. So the idea that's a perfect example of a relative versus absolute macro. Now let's go take a look at the Visual Basic Code to show you how this works out. If you click on the Visual Basic Code up here, Visual Basic Editor, it opens up this editor and you have several modules in here. It looks like I have a Book 4 module, I have a function module, and I have a personal module. Now the personal module, the VB work project, personal, is where the macros are stored if you store them in the personal macro workbook. So looks like I click on this module 1, looks like I have a blank one in module 1 from the previous class. So you probably just have a module 1. And up here it shows me the subroutines. Now you have to double click on module 1 and it will come up. Yeah, sometimes you just click on it one time, it doesn't come up. You have to kind of double click and it should come up. So I'm assuming you got that okay, right? So on this here, what we have is, this is your macro that we wrote for opening the file. So it looks like I clicked on cell A1 first, and then the command I used was workbooks open, and the parameter was file name equals, colon equals, and then I put in the path. So if I change this name out here, I can open up a different file. So that's just the simple command. And it looks like after I opened the file up, I clicked on cell A2. So it's recording every little click that happens. Now, here's your absolute macro. So you see it. So here's the code for it, the subroutine for absolute macro. This is all comments on top. Now right here, the first command in the absolute macro is to go to cell A1. So range A1.select is a command that actually selects the cell. And then it says, okay, wherever the active cell is, well, where's the active cell? A1, because we just went there. Put in this information in the active cell. And then it says go to cell A2, and then wherever the active cell, which happens to be A2, go ahead and put in the address. Now, if I spell something wrong, I can come in here. I can fix all these little spelling issues. I don't have to rewrite a macro just to fix a spelling issue. Then it goes to A3, and then it goes to A4. Now, there's another command here. I don't really like this format RC1C. This is a Visual Basic command, and the macro does automatically. There's another command I use in Visual Basic called value. It makes a little bit more sense. You don't have to do this. I'm just showing you that the real command here is ActiveCell.value equals, and that means it puts this name in the value of that cell. So this is just another command that does the same thing that this command does. I just don't like this command, but the value makes a little more sense to me. You don't need to change that because it does exactly the same thing. Let's look at the relative macro. So the comments on top are what they are. Then it says the first command is to do what? Go to the active cell. Now, where's the active cell at this point? Wherever your cursor is. Wherever you have your cursor placed is considered the active cell. And then it says, well, wherever the active cell is, go ahead and put Jeff Hutchinson in there. And then it says, go to the active cell, but then offset by 1, meaning go down 1, and then put in the word test. And then go down 1 again and put in the Salt Lake City. See how that's doing that? Now, you see the difference in these. The absolute macro puts in the absolute physical location, where the relative macro does not put in physical location. Now, if I were to copy this code up here and pasted it right to this first line of this one, now what did I just do to my relative macro? I sort of made it absolute, didn't I? Because I'm telling the system, go to A1 first. So that's the idea. These are just commands that you can type in here. Now, another command that's kind of useful is, this is a Visual Basic command. It's a pretty simple command. It's called msgbox. So when you start writing really large macros, sometimes it's nice to put this little message box at the end of it. And so therefore, when the macro is finished, it comes back with a little prompt that tells you it's finished. And so again, if you have a lot of formatting macros and you want to make sure that it's all done before you start touching things. So sometimes you can put this little simple command called message box and just put the word finished in there to see that. All right, now another command you can use is this. I'll go through and run this command real quick, so I'll click on this sheet, Control-Shift-R, and see it comes back with this little message box that says finished. So it tells you that it finished the macro. Now another important command is this. If I click up in this absolute macro, there's an option here called debug. Now, if you click on the word debug, I put my cursor right here at the absolute macro, and I'm going to click on the word debug. Well, this is important because if you have a macro that's going to save you hours of time and it doesn't work, you've got to figure out how to make it work. If I choose step into, debug, step into, and there's an F8 key I can press. So then I can press the F8 key on the keyboard and I can walk through it. So if I do, that was F9. Okay, F8. So the first command is going to run is A1. So you see it went to A1. Then I'm going to hit the F8 again. Now it's going to put in Jeff Hutchinson. Now it's going to go to A2. And now it's going to put in the next command, which is the address. Now it's going to go to A3. I'm going to hit F8 each time. Each time I hit F8, it puts in a new command. And I'm all done. I have to actually hit F8 one more time to get out of the macro. So the idea of that is you want to be able to use the debug command to watch when it actually crashes, if it crashes. An example of a crash is this. Let's say, for example, I start in E. I start my macro right now. My first click is to click in A4 and type in some stuff, okay? Now I'm going to run the macro, but I'm going to start in C this time. What was the first command? Go over 5 cells. So it goes 1, 2, and then hits the edge of the screen and crashes. So that's a typical crash. If the macro's moving around, but it doesn't have room to move to, then it hits the side of the wall and it crashes. So the idea of that is you want to make sure that sometimes it crashes, and so you have to find out why and where it's crashing. And so therefore, that's when you can go through and do a debug to watch it happen. Okay, so if I click on this spot right here, open up my Visual Basic Editor, go to my relative macro, and I want to do a debug on that, which is a F8 and F8. So it's going to be relative from that place. It's going to put that in. I can walk through each command and watch each one. Now I'm going to do the message box that pops up. So you have to make sure you hit F8 one more time to make sure all that yellow disappears. And so you want to be able to use the debug tool. Now there are other tools that you could use, but that basic debug is enough to get you by right now. But we're going through a lot more debug capabilities in a Visual Basic class. So that's kind of what we're looking at here. Just be able to walk through it step by step to find out where the problems occur. Now, if you have a macro that you can't figure out what the problem is, but it crashes right in the middle of the macro, the worst case scenario is you write 2 macros. You might write one macro up to that point, then you do that one piece manually, then you run a second macro from that point. Why would it not work? This is a computer program. I mean, there's a lot of things that could happen. I've even seen differences between different versions of Excel. A macro that may have worked in one version doesn't work in another version, or vice versa. And so there are little problems that happen with macros, but like, for example, if I were to do an export, an import for some information, and I import some information into Excel using a macro, that works most of the time, but sometimes it doesn't. So why wouldn't it work? Well, sometimes some of the export commands are called an internal versus external command. So if it's an internal command within Excel, then it will most likely work. But if it has to go out, like if I go out here and I'm running a macro right now, and I move this around like this, it's not recording any of this that I'm doing. I'm out of Excel. So it's not doing anything if I move these icons around. But when I go back to Excel, it picks up recording again. So the idea of that is that sometimes these commands, these export commands, actually call an external command. It actually physically goes out of Excel to do something in Windows and then pull some stuff in. If it's an external call, that import might not work. Otherwise, if it's an internal call, it will work. So that's just a technical details, but just understand there's a difference between those two. Let's write some macros. Now you got a little bit of skills here. If you go to File, Open, Browse. Let's see what we want to use. Very bottom of the list in the folder is a worksheet 1. Now I'm going to do something a little bit different here. What we're going to do is we're going to create a format macro. And let me zoom in my screen a little bit, so I'll just highlight these and zoom in a little bit so we can see them all. All right, now we're going to create a format macro. So I'm going to basically go to January. I'm going to format this worksheet, but then I'm going to actually go to February and run my macro, and it's going to automatically format February. And then I'm going to go to March and run my macro, and it'll automatically format March. So this is a format macro. But come down to June. The problem with June, I'm going to actually add some things to June. So with June, I'm going to actually insert another row, and I'm just going to copy this down. So what I did is in June, I actually created 5 people in here, where January only has 4. I'm going to go to July. I'm going to insert a couple of rows, and I'm just going to copy and paste. So I have to form. So the problem is the sheet is going to be different sizes. The sheets are different sizes. And now we have a sheet here in July that has 6 people in it. June has 5 people, and these others have 4. There's a little trick I want to show you about how to record a macro and how to overcome data that changes. If you got a database that's changing in size, and you want the macro to work in the new change size. So I wanted to create a little example where we can show that. All right, let's go to January. And we're going to write a macro. We're going to simply click on the bottom here. I'm going to go through and practice really quick so you can see what I'm doing and how I'm going to do this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start the macro, but I'm going to click in cells A1. Now, if I were to select it with my mouse like this, then I'm selecting 2 through 7. That won't work in June and July because that's a physical location. But if I were to hold the Shift key down and highlight it this way, that's still going to happen because that's a physical location. But there's another command I can use, which is the Control key. If I do a Control down arrow, see it jumps to the bottom. Control up changes to the top. So if I click on cell A2 and do a Control Shift down arrow, it actually jumps to the bottom. So I'm not selecting to the bottom. I'm actually saying select all the way to the bottom. And therefore, it will work on those others. And then I can simply go through and format it using the format tools. And then I can click on this one and do a Control Shift right arrow, which highlights everything to the end of the sheet. And then I can go through and format that. Then I can click on here and I can do a Control Shift down arrow, right arrow, and then I can do borders and things like that. So I'm using my Control Shift down arrow to get to the bottom because I don't know where the bottom is. So that's how we're going to do this. So we're going to click, we're going to write an absolute macro. So you have to make a decision as you go through this. Do we want this to be an absolute macro or a relative macro? That's the first decision you have to make. So we're going to make sure we click on the bottom. The first click is going to be in the sales rep. So we have to decide that first. Record a macro. We're going to call this format. Now, maybe format is a reserved word. So I'll put my 1 out there just in case. I can put a Shift F for my keyboard command. And the second decision I have to make is, where do I want to store this macro? A lot of people, if you don't think about this as you're going through it, then it's going to be stored in the wrong place. So this might be something I might want to use in multiple sheets. Maybe this is an email I get from somebody and I got to go through and fix it up. So say you do an import from a database, and then once you do that import, you have to go clean it up a little bit. And so clean it up by deleting columns and on and on and on. So that is what you would do there. So you think, well, I don't know what sheet it's going to be called, so therefore I want to put it there so I have access to it. And then, of course, putting some description in here of what this macro was designed to do, and so that you can reference it that way. Okay, so are you both with me? If you are, you can say okay.
Yes.
I'm recording right now. So my mouse is right here. So my first click with my mouse is A2. Then I'm going to do a Control-Shift down arrow to say select all the way to the bottom of the data. And then I'm going to go to Home with my mouse. I'm going to give it some shade. Okay, now I'm going to click on A2 again. I'm going to do a Control-Shift right arrow to highlight those columns. And then I'm going to put a shade on that. Then I'm going to click on A2 again, Control-Shift down arrow, Control-Shift right arrow, which will highlight everything. And then I'll simply put in my all borders in here. So once I stick all borders in, that put borders out there. Now I want to make sure that these columns are evenly spaced out. So I'm going to click on B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I and move the line out a little ways so that it moves out like this. I'm going to scale it down a little bit so I can see it on the screen. So now I've evenly spaced out each of those fields. And then when I'm done, I'm going to click somewhere on the sheet. And I can either I can do more format if I wanted to. I could maybe put in some currency values in there, some percentages. Whatever you want to do, you just do right now. Whatever you need to do, whatever you would do manually is what you put in here. But that's pretty much all I want to do at this point. So we're going to go to the Developer tab, and we're going to say I want to stop recording. Now, if it doesn't work for some reason, you might have to go back and re-record it. If you do, then you just put in another number 1 and 2 and 3. Now I'm going to go to February. I'm going to run this macro. Control-Shift-F, and it actually formats it. Go to March. Control-Shift-F, formats it. April. I'm going to June, which is my larger sheet, if you remember. Control-Shift-F, and it formatted. It actually went to the bottom, and it actually formatted it according to the rules. July is even bigger than June. Control-Shift-F, and actually formatted. So that's kind of a little trick to use an absolute macro, but you might have data that may be in different positions or different sizes. And so using that Control-Shift down arrow, select all the way to the bottom, that's all I want you to do. So wherever the bottom is, just go for it. And so that's how that works. So that's a format macro that might be very useful. So you have any formatting that's done on a routine basis, then you want to be able to go into this and write a macro to do that. Any kind of import from a database, there's always cleanup work. Somebody asked me the other day, they said, can I write a macro to clean up my import when I'm done? That's what it's for. I said, but you can also write a macro to do the import and the cleanup at the same time. And they just kind of opened their eyes. They were thinking, wow, that's great. The macros are going to be very static. So the file name that you're importing has to be the same location, the same file name. So if you put information to common file name, and some people, they think that's an acceptable solution. You could write a Visual Basic program to come back and prompt you for the name. And then you type in the name, and then it goes and gets it. Using Visual Basic, there's a little bit more power there, but there's a lot of power just in writing a macro to do things that are very routine. All right, so that's a little bit about a format macro. That sound interesting? Let's go to File, Open. Any questions on that, or you okay? Were you able to get it to work? We're going to open up a file called Filter. And now we're going to create what I call a sort macro. Now, let me show you a couple of tricks. Again, little tips and tricks. Now, you remember when we created an absolute macro and you clicked like that, it actually puts the physical position of that click in there, of an absolute macro. So the problem is if I were to do a sort on this and my mouse happens to be out here and I go to Data, Sort, it comes back with an error that says it can't find the data. So that means that every time you start your macro, the first click needs to be inside the database somewhere. So therefore, if I start here, start my macro, then I always have to make sure I do a click inside there so that your mouse happens to be out here when you run the macro, the first click will then push it right there. That's another little trick that I've discovered. So we're going to go through and sort this by two different ways. I'm going to first sort it by department, and I'm going to create a little button and put that in here to sort it by department, and then maybe by last name. And then I'm going to sort it by status and last name. Okay, so we're going to start with the sales rep. Our first click is going to be here, and then we're going to go to our sort and do the sort. So we're going to create a macro, one to sort by department, and the second macro to sort by status. So we're going to click in this spot right here, go to your developer tab. Now, should we use relative or absolute? This is going to be an absolute macro because we're going to let the system expand. The sort will find all the data as long as I'm in the data sheet somewhere. So it's going to be absolute. Go to macro. We're going to call this macro sort, and we're going to call this department, D-E-P-T. Now, if you want to record it, you think you might have to record it twice and put a 1 in there. So therefore, if you have to re-record it, put a 2. Now, we don't need a keyboard command because we're going to create a button to actually do the sorting. The question is, should this be in the personal macro workbook or in this workbook? Well, all the sorting is based on this workbook, so I would think that this would be in this workbook. So I would use that, and then I'd put a little description in here. So there we are. I'm going to say OK. Okay, now I'm recording right now, so I have to click inside the data area first, so that gets recorded in the macro. And then we're going to go to
Did
data.
you put in a shortcut key or no?
I did not. Then I go to sort. So I'm going to sort it by department first, add another level, and then sort it by last name, and maybe by first name. Guess there's a couple of last names out there. All right, so there we go. Say OK. And that's it. That's all I want to do is sort it by that field. So I stop my macro. So I go to developer, stop recording. That's it. Now we're creating another macro that's going to be sorted by status. So we'll click in administration, go to developer, make sure you're in the absolute mode, go to macro. We're going to call this sort by status. It's in this workbook, no shortcut key. And you put a description in there if you want. Say OK. Now I'm recording right now, so my first click has to be inside here somewhere so that if I'm out, it will always make sure it clicks inside. Go to data, sort by status, and then by last name, and then by first name. Then say OK, and stop my macro. Okay, so did you get the macros created?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so now we're going to create a button. Insert, shapes, choose a little rectangle shape, and we're going to draw a tiny little rectangle right next to the word department. And then we're going to go to insert, shapes, rectangle shape, and we're going to draw a little rectangle right in the status. Now, oftentimes what I'll do is I'll actually copy and paste one of these buttons multiple times because the chance of getting them exactly the same is it's difficult. So that way I copy it, that way I have the exact same size button. You see they're slightly off. Then I'm going to right-click on that button, on the department button, and there's an option called Assign Macro. You click on the Assign Macro, and I'm going to assign the department sort macro to the department button, my department macro. I'm going to assign the status macro to the status button. Now, if I want to sort these fields, I just simply click on the button, and it sorts it. Click on the status, it sorts it. Now, it really wasn't that hard to sort a data source like this, but it does take a few more steps. So if I was going to do this manually, I'd have to say, okay, I have to first go to the Data tab. That's one click. There's 2 clicks. Then I might have to change this. That's 3 clicks. Fix these up. There's 4 clicks, and now I got to sort it. So it took maybe 4, maybe 5 steps to actually sort that field. Not too big a deal. That's pretty easy to do. You could also just click on this field and go to the Data tab, which is click on the Data tab. That's 1 click. Click on this AZ button here. That's 2 clicks. That wasn't too bad either. That was pretty easy to do. But this is like 2 or 3 times faster. Okay. You can see how slick that is. So if you've got a data source that you're constantly resorting it different ways to understand and view the data for different perspectives, then this would be a real slick way to actually create a sort. And so again, we talk about productivity, doing things quicker. You know, if I have to sort, 20 times a day, then that takes a lot of clicks. So 20 times a day times 4 clicks or 5 clicks, is 100 clicks, right? So we got 100 clicks versus 20 clicks. So I'd be clicking this 20 times to get that up. Otherwise, I'd be doing 20 times 5 to do the manual sort. So again, it may take a little effort in the beginning to create the macro, but it might save time in the long run if this is something you use a lot. So that's just kind of an interesting little technique of using the sort keeper, the macro to the sort. Very simple command, not a very elaborate, massive type of command, but it does some short little commands. I have one I use in Word. I created a macro in Word that I use. I do a little bit of formatting on a sheet, and I do the same formatting all the time. And I just wrote a little macro to do the format for me. So it only takes me maybe 5 or 6 commands to format the item. I can do it in one keyboard command. It's just a little bit quicker, a little bit more streamlined. So hope you enjoyed that one. That's always a fun one to think about. All right, let's go to File, Open, Browse. I don't know if I have this file in here or not, but let's see if it's here. And if not, we'll have to create one. Oh, yeah, it's called User Input Form. So we're going to create a User Input Form macro. And what we're going to create, the problem here is that this should be a blank form, but when I open up the form, somebody actually typed in their information, and then they actually saved it in the form. And so I'm going to create me a little button over here called Reset. And the Reset is going to simply delete the information. So I'm going to practice what the reset button is going to do. All it's going to do is it's going to delete with it like this. And then it's going to come back to the first cell and ready for me to start typing. That's all it's going to do. Let me put all this back. Let's create a macro. We're going to start out here. It's going to be an absolute macro because this form is in an absolute position. It could be a huge form. So here's your information. So we're going to start here. Our first click is going to be in Josh. Delete, 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 and then come back to Josh, to the first name field when we're done. That's what all the macro is going to do. It's just going to delete that information and reset it to blank and then go on. So we're going to click in D, put our developer tab. Now, should this be a relative or absolute macro? It's in an absolute location, right? So it's not changing. So we'll keep it in absolute. Go to our macro. We're going to call this reset. Now, reset is one of those I discovered I think a couple days ago when I taught this class. Reset is a reserved word. So again, I'll put a 1 on the end to make sure it's not reserved. We don't need a keyboard command for this one because we're going to create a button to click on a reset button. Now, should it be in this workbook or in the personal macro workbook? Which do you think?
This workbook.
And the reason why is because what if I email this form to somebody? I want the macro to continue to work. So you see, you have to make these decisions as you go into it, and that way it saves you the hassle of kind of figuring it out later. Okay, which I'm recording right now. It says stop recording, so I'm in the process of recording. I'm going to click on Josh, backspace key, backspace, 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 backspace. And then I'm going to use my mouse and click up in B2 as my starting input field. And then I'm going to stop my macro. Very simple macro, not too difficult. Create a button. Here's my button. I'll call that button reset form. And down. Myself a little button here. I'm going to right click on that button. Assign my reset macro to it. And if I put in some junk in here, you can see that the reset macro will simply clear it out. Very simple macro, but very useful. So I could have deleted that stuff myself, but the fact is that I'm going to clear it and reset all the settings to the default values. And so that's the idea of a reset macro. Now this could be a huge form. This could be a large form, and you want to make sure that you reset all your information.
Can you show one more time how to add the macro to the reset form thing?
Just right click on the button.
Oh,
You assign macro. Now you might write another macro that might actually fill out the form for you. So if this is a form that you fill out from time to time, like a request form, then you can write a macro and just run the macro and it will fill out the form for you and put all your vitals in there. And then you'll just save you some time. So basically, the first time you fill out the form, record it. And then you just run that macro. Next time you have to fill out that form and it will do it for you automatically. So that's the idea. Very simple macro. Not too bad. But I think it's pretty useful, and I think it'd be nice to have. You could write a macro, maybe have another fill out form or fill out information. Or you might have a macro that might be stored in your personal macro workbook. So when you open up this form, you can run it to fill in your stuff. Okay, so let's take a look at what can we do with these macros. Well, we can create buttons to run a macro. You can create keyboard commands to run a macro. Let's go to Developer, click on the word macro, the macro button here, which comes up with this little interface. So here's my absolute macro. And if you go to the options, click on that absolute macro, go to options, that actually gives a little dialog box that tells you what keyboard command you actually assigned to that macro. So if you have to unassign that keyboard command or give it a different command, possibly, you can do that. And there's your description down below. So then you can actually use that and update this information. So you can click on each of these and see what the keyboard command was for each one of these. So this is a little editor that you can clean them up too. You can also click on this and run the macro at this point. Now, another one is up on the top of the ribbon here. There's this thing called this quick access toolbar. If you click that little arrow underneath of that quick access toolbar, come down to where it says more commands. So we'll click on that little arrow, go where it says more commands, and in the middle ribbon here, there's a thing called popular commands, commands not in the ribbon, and all commands. So what we're going to do is we're going to add additional commands to the ribbon on top. In this case, I want to add a macro. So here's my list of macros. Here's my absolute macro. So I can add that absolute macro and the relative macro to the quick access toolbar. Now this looks a little bad. I don't really like the way this looks, so we're going to modify that macro and give it a little icon. In this case, I'm going to give it a little pig. And I'm also going to clean up the name a little bit so it just says address absolute. And then I'm going to click on my second macro and modify that. I'm going to give it an 8-ball. And I'm going to clean up my name a little bit so that it's not too large. So you can just click on the macro, go to the word modify, assign it a keyboard command, and change the display name. If you say OK to that, it actually puts those macros up on top of my screen. So if I go through and create a new blank workbook, hit my little pig, it actually puts in my address. I click in the middle of the sheet, hit my 8-ball, it puts in my address, and it says finished. So you can put the macros up in the quick access toolbar. Are you okay with that? Go to File, choose the word Options, come down to where it says Customize Ribbon, and now what we're going to do is we're going to create a new ribbon called Macros, because you may have created a whole bunch of macros and you want to have quick access to those through its own ribbon. So I'm going to click on the View ribbon tab because I want the macro button to appear right behind the view. And I'm going to come down to where it says New tab. Now I'm going to show you where all this is written in a few minutes. We also want to create a new group. So I have two groups and one called New tab. Now the groups are up here. As you can see, these are groups. Here's the code group, here's the add-in group, and here's the controls group. So you can create different groups for each one of these. Okay, so the name of the macro of the new tab, I'm going to rename that. I'm going to call that macros. That's what the ribbon I want it to call it. The group, new group, I'm going to rename the new group. I'm going to call the new group HR macros. And then I'm going to put the other one, I'm going to call that engineering. So I can actually give the groups different names if I have certain commands I've written for certain types of functions or operations. I can create different groups for each one of those so I can keep them straight of which macros and what the definition of these macros are. Now I'm going to add some macros to my list. So come down to macros. Again, I'll show you where all this is written in the book in a minute. I can put my absolute macro in this one. And in the engineering macros, I'll put my, where do I format one? I could put my sort macros. I'll put the open file macro in that one. So I'll add that one. Okay, so I have my address macros and my HR macros. My engineering macros, I've got my open file macro. And then I can rename those. Give it a little icon here. How about something like this? Clean up the name a little bit so it looks a little nicer. Click on this one, rename it. People head. Name that one, give that a new icon, give that a key. Find an icon that looks kind of close to what you're trying to do. Now I just renamed those macros and gave them an icon. And when I say OK, it's going to create a new ribbon. That ribbon's going to be placed on top of the screen to access my macros. Now I can put any command up there I want. I can create a ribbon that says my personal commands. And it could be macros and commands. It doesn't matter. It's OK to that. Creates me a new tab up here called macros. And I have my address absolute macro, my address relative, and my open file macro in the different groups. That's the idea of what we can do with macros. Now, the only thing we can do now is just write a few more macros just to get some more experience with it. You kind of know how to debug it if you have a problem. You kind of know what to do with them. You can create ribbons, you can create quick access toolbars, buttons, and so you have to do something with them at some point. And then I go into the Visual Basic Editor in a more detailed screen. So I added a little section here about Visual Basic Editor, and I went through some discussion about what it is, how it works, how you switch between Excel, these kind of things. And so a little bit more what the Explorer is. So I'd like to touch on this for a minute. So this, what a personal macro workbook is, what the projects are. We go through these little folders here that we looked at, module folders, and those are the modules we added in here. How to rename a folder. Here's how to rename a folder. So if you have a folder that's dedicated to a certain feature, you can create a dedicated module and give it a new name type thing. And then here's all the debugging features. So I wanted to touch on that very quickly. Let's find our Visual Basic Editor. There it is. So what I wanted to touch on was this window on this right side is called the Project Explorer. If you delete those fields, if you delete them out of there, completely out of there, you can simply bring them back. Go to View, go to your Project Explorer. There's your Project Explorer. There's another view, which is your Properties window. So those are the two windows I could use. The Properties window isn't that useful, but the Project Explorer is. So in the Project Explorer, if I click on one of these modules here, like this one here, I'll click on that module and right-click on it, but there's no option to rename the module. A lot of times you think you just right-click to rename it, but renaming occurs down in the properties. So when you click on a module, you look at the properties of that module, and this is where I can put in class. I'll put in 5-21. That's my module that I was using for this class. And I didn't like that dash in there. Interesting. So I'll call this class. So there's my class module. So the idea is that you can give these modules names, and therefore when you create new macros, it will create a new module for it. And then you can also cut and paste modules. So for example, if I take this module here and I created this, here's my filter module. Remember we did the filter one? Here's the code for that, the sort macros. If I want to give this to somebody, we want to talk about transporting of macros. I can simply just cut and paste this out. I can take this code, both these codes, just simply copy it and create a new file and paste it in that new file. Or I can email this code to them. If they know how to put the code into the Visual Basic modules, then you could you just cut and paste the code. It's just text is all it is. So with the idea of transporting, a lot of times you want to be careful of, if you have a macro that somebody wants, you go over to their computer, you sit down at their computer, you add the macro to their system. You are now the support person for every macro problem that they have. So you want to avoid that, okay? So what I suggest you do is, if you have a macro that you want, that somebody needs, I'm going to close this off, go back to Excel, and I'll simply create a new file, and I'll save this file, save as. I'll save it as a file name called macros. I'll put macro 1. So in other words, I would create a file, and I would call that macro 1, and I would store those macros in the file. And then I would simply email that file to the person. And I tell them, every time you want to run this macro, just make sure this file is open, and you can run that macro. Okay, so if I have macro 1, and I save that off as macro 1, now I'm going to go into my Visual Basic editor. Let's take my, let's see, how about we'll take the, there's my class. I'll take one of these up here. I'll take my open file. I'll do this absolute macro. Take the absolute macro, copy it, and it's called address 1. I'll look up here and look for my macro. There's my macro 1 file I just created. There's no modules down here. So I'll insert a new module, and I'll just paste that code in that module. So now that code is now in this module. Oftentimes what I'll do is also give it a new name, because now I've got 2 modules. I've got absolute 1 and absolute 2. If you had absolute 1 in 2 different files, it will run it, but it will do it in a certain order. And so you want to make sure you're running the right macro. Okay, so here I have an absolute macro here. I have a keyboard assigned to it. And I'll simply go and click out of it. Close it off. Take this file, save it off. It's got a macro in it, so we have to switch it over to a macro-enabled file. So I'll go to File, Save As. We have to switch it over to a macro-enabled file, so the system knows that this is a macro. There's a macro is contained in this file. I'll save that off. Save it over here. And I'll take that file, share, and I'll email this file as an attachment. And I'll address that person and send that email to them. And I'll give them instructions of how to use it. Always have this file open. Always make sure this file is open when you run this macro, and it will work. So that's what I suggest when you talk about transporting macros to other people. This is probably the more cleaner way, because now you're not actually physically sitting down at somebody's computer and actually making that work. And again, you'll be the support person forevermore. Every time they have a macro problem, it's like you're going to be there. So this is a way to kind of pull yourself out of that world and actually just provide the information that you need. And then if you have to make a change to it, good. Then you would open up the macro, and you open up the file, make the change to the macro, and then you send it back to them again. Call it, macros 2. And then you just change the name again. So there's just a couple of ideas of how to get this information to other people if you need. Okay, so let's create another one. Let's create one more. This one's kind of interesting. A lot of people have asked me before, if I have like an invoice or something, and I want to create an invoice, and I use the today function, equals today, hit return, that puts in the current date, today's date. The problem is when I open up this file at a later date, that date changes to the current date. So a lot of people have asked if they're saying, is there a way to put a static date out there? So I won't have to type in it, just pulls it off the computer and it puts a static date there. And the answer to that is macros. Okay, so let me go through and practice what I'm going to do first before I do it. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a macro and they say this is where I want to put the date. I'll say equals today. And instead of hitting the enter key, I don't want to hit the enter key because I'm going to go down one. I can come up to my formulas ribbon tab and hit the auto sum, and it will actually accept the formula, but not go anywhere. And then I'm going to take that date, I'm going to copy it, and then I'm going to go to paste special, and I'm going to paste it using the values option. And then I'm going to hit the escape key on the keyboard to get rid of the marquee, and now I have a static date. If you look at that date, it's no longer a date function, it's a static date. So we can write a macro. We're going to click on the cell that you want to do it in. Go to developer. Now should this be a relative or absolute macro? Yeah, it's done. If that date is in the exact same position every time, then it can be absolute. But if that date is not in the exact same position every time, it could be in different places, but you want to use it for different forms maybe, then you need to do it relative. So maybe we can do a relative this time. And that means that, well, wherever you put your cursor is where it's going to actually put that information. We're going to record our macro. We're going to call this fixed date. I'm assuming that's not a reserved command, but just to make sure, I'll just put a 1 out there. Maybe we'll create a little button to put the date out there, something like that. And then it'll be in this workbook. So we're going to say equals today. And then I'll go to my formulas, hit the auto sum, so it doesn't go anywhere. Copy. Paste special values. And then I'll hit the escape key to make it a static date. And then maybe I'll create a button now to, first I have to stop the recording. I clicked here, I don't know what I did there. Maybe that caused a problem. But now we're going to go through and create a button here, maybe to just put that date out there. I'll create a little button that would simply say insert. And this is where you have to decide what is the right approach for this. And we're going to say assign to macro. It's called fixed date. All right, so if I put my cursor here and I run that macro, it should put that date in there. It moved it too. See that moved? So I click here and hit that. It's going to put it in there. So we put there. So it looks like these fields aren't wide enough. So that may be something else we might want to add to the macro, is make sure that this, double click on that as part of the macro to make sure that it's wide enough. So that's why I said sometimes you have to go back and re-record it. So wherever you put your cursor, it's going to put that value and it's going to move it. Now, because it moved it here, I made that mistake. I'm going to go back to the Visual Basic code and fix that. So I'll go to Visual Basic. You can see that it put in, after it did the application copy mode, it said active cell offset 1, and it actually put this in here. And so this is what I need to get rid of, is this code right here. I'm not going to get rid of it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to a little single click on front of it, which comments it out. Because what if I remove it and it crashes on me now? So I'll just quote it out and I'll run it again to see if that's going to fix the problem. So I'll come over here and say, and sure enough, it put it in there. I should have added the adjustments on that. So See, now it's not moving anymore. So that worked. So that would go back to my code and get rid of it at this point, once I know that it's actually working. But when you start deleting stuff, you're going to mess up the code and you might screw something up. So I usually just comment it out and then run it to see if it works. And if it works, then I'll go back and clean it up later or just leave it. So there's a macro there. So that's an idea there. Okay, so then I went through and it said, here's some macro examples. So then I went through and did a format sheet macro. Here's a print setup macro. So if you have a printer that you have to set up every time you print to it, you can write a macro to do all that setup for you. Here's an active sheet. A name, it actually is similar to a format one. Oh, this is the one that formats the sheet. Here's a sort macro. We did the sort macro. Here's a user input macro. So there's a couple in there. I did a few of these, as you can see. So that's pretty much it for macros. I mean, there's a lot more that you can cover because, like I said, the Visual Basic class is a 2-day class. But there's a lot of code that you can learn from macros. A lot of times, even in the class, I would tell people that we use macros to build code. I don't want to type in a bunch of code to format something when I can write a macro to do the code automatically. So even in the Visual Basic class, there are times when we resort to using the macro feature to build macros because it's so much faster to create the code doing a sequence of commands. And then you can go into the Visual Basic and adjust that to modify it a little bit if you needed to. But that's kind of the objective of macros, is to really make things more streamlined. Everybody who understands this macros a little bit better has a deeper understanding of Excel and knowing that there's so much more that can be done. So basically anything that you can't do or things you can do manually, you can write a macro to do that for you automatically. And so we do have things that we do on a routine basis that would be nice to have something like this. And a few of those tricks that I showed you was key because you want to be able to use it in a multi-range area.